election coverage has been dominated by one issue, perhaps above many others: the surge in support for reform. Yes, the Reform Party received more than 14% of votes and currently has 5 members of Parliament now, after James McMurdoch was confirmed as the surprise Member of Parliament for South Basildon and East Thurrock, just a little bit earlier this evening. Now, Reform came second in a staggering 98 seats and has promised to professionalise the party and move the fight on to a new Labour government. So, what was behind the rise in Reform and what happens now? I'm delighted to be joined by Reform UK's biggest donor, Zia Youssef. And Zia, this is perhaps on the upper end of expectations for many journalists, at least, of where people were thinking Reform could come. Most people I was speaking to were saying 1, maybe 2 seats, and now you have 5.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, we shouldn't forget that October 2022, Reform are polling at around 4%. As of around 4.5 weeks ago, Nigel Farage was not even standing. So when we think about what has just happened in terms of momentum, astonishing. Reform have just delivered 14% of the vote share on a shoestring budget, having only been led by Nigel, the generational political talent, for about four and a little bit weeks, having had a mainstream media that has been pretty openly hostile against them, and no national infrastructure, right? All of those, well, maybe one won't change in the near future, but the rest of those are, I can assure you, going to change. As we speak, the party is professionalising, it is building a national infrastructure.
I would put it to you that actually Reform has had a bit of a lucky escape by only electing these 5 MPs. Because, as Nigel Farage admitted himself, there were lots of candidates who the party didn't really know who they were, and it caused the party a lot of trouble, particularly in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Had Reform done a little bit better and elected perhaps 20 MPs, you couldn't be sure who these people were. Perhaps that would make it very, very difficult to control a group in Parliament.
I wouldn't go so far as to say necessarily that we wouldn't have known who they were. But I take the point that, look, I can assure you what is going to be very clear, the next roster of candidates that we put forward, the candidates that we put forward in the inevitable by-elections that are going to be coming up are going to be truly exceptional. We're going to have a first-class vetting process, again, as we speak, that is being stood up. So we would absolutely have a much higher degree of confidence in the quality of those candidates, yeah.
And yet you're going to have a mighty battle, not just with the Labour Party, but with the Conservative Party for sort of the soul of the centre-right in the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party will be able to point to, and are pointing to, more than 100 seats where the difference between the Tory and the Labour vote share was more than eclipsed by the Reform vote share.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think that's a very easy thing for the Conservatives to point to. I will just tell you there's data to back this up, and all of the anecdotes on the doorsteps is the notion that Reform voters would have voted for the Tories if the Reform wasn't there is a fantasy. It's a complete and utter fantasy, right? There's one party that is responsible for Labour being in power. There is one party that is responsible for the total repudiation that the Conservatives have received at this election. It is the Conservative Party. Even if Nigel hadn't stood, even if Reform had stood out all of its candidates, Labour would have won a significant majority.
Hang on, the Labour Party won 33.8% of the vote. Mm-hmm. When we were discussing whether or not the Reform Party will actually make the difference between we were talking about the Labour Party on 44% of the vote. They underperformed by double digits. I mean, this could have been a lot closer election. This could have been a very big surprise of an election. I mean, the polls were out by 10 points.
Mm-hmm. So the assumption you're making is you're looking at the national vote share and thinking that that translates into seats. I've been listening to the programme thus far. Clearly, that is not the case. The data does actually show, if you actually look at it forensically, seat by seat, you cannot make the argument credibly that if Reform didn't exist, the Tories would have won a majority. It's just not true. To that point, however, look, we are in a situation where I was just reading, this is, I think, the second most disproportionate result of any advanced democracy in history. When you look at, for example, sort of 33.7% vote share for Labour, 63% of the seats, Reform, 14.3 odd percent of the votes, 0.5%.
Almost
of
a million votes per seat.
Almost a million. Now, the good news, I want to be really clear, we're not walking around whinging here. We think, like, we will elect Nigel Farage as Prime Minister in 2029 under a first-past-the-post system. We are not making an assumption that we will have PR, even if PR might be a good thing. It'll be tough to make that happen. Secondly, the reality is that the Conservative Party, as you said, is I don't think the Conservative Party, as somebody who was a member of the Conservative Party, I don't think the Conservative Party as we know it exists anymore. I don't think it it clearly doesn't even know who its next leader is going to be. And look at the people who are putting their hats into the ring. They essentially should be in different parties. They share almost no political philosophy. We have a generational, once in a lifetime political talent around whom we can unite. You know exactly where he stands. There's absolutely unity. And that is actually, as someone who built a startup, so I actually know the advantages that you can have over a big incumbent. You get to build your team step by step. And every single person joining that team, and by that team I mean members, I mean prospective voters, as well as obviously the staff and the candidates, they know exactly what they are signing up for. And they are very excited about Nigel essentially delivering all of the things that we know we need to deliver to return Britain to its greatness.
Now, you've burst personally onto the political scene in this country in a way perhaps we haven't seen before in such a rapid timescale. What made you decide to sort of become a public spokesperson for this party? And can we expect you to stand in one of these by-elections that comes up in the next year or two?
Well, look, my motivations are that I love my country. I've started a business. I sold it last year. And I could see the direction that this country was going in. And I'm also convinced about what an incredible future this country can have. I feel like we're at a real inflection point for the country. When Nigel said he wasn't standing, I must confess I was pretty despondent, borderline depressed. And when he said that he was going to stand, I felt like this was the moment. And if I didn't do it, I would regret it for the rest of my life. And I said to Nigel, I will help you, yes, with some money, but in any way, shape or form that I can. And that's what I'm doing.
Well, where Nigel might need a bit more help is in making sure that the right people are invited into certain rooms and that there perhaps is a bit more security. Let's take a look at this.
Are you downwind of a couple already? You've had a bigger lunch than I've had. God, he must be screaming. He's absolutely steaming. I decided that I would not. Boring. I'm enjoying this. Any more for any more?
Actually, yes.
Oh, I mean, you can't help but laugh. But Zia, I mean, it's not the most professional start to Nigel Farage's parliamentary career.
Well, look, what we just saw there, the people responsible for that were the overgrown infants who resort to shouting, ad hominem attacks generally at Nigel. And what they don't realise they're doing, or maybe they do, is essentially they are casting aspersions on almost a fifth of the country now, right? And I can tell you, we've seen this in America. We're seeing it increasingly here. I've been really, really surprised as a voter myself, just how popular and how people, particularly on the left, seem to think it is a sensible, useful strategy to sneer at voters, to make fun of them for really actually legitimate concerns, right? I mean, Nigel, again, I know Nigel very well personally. He is none of those things. And I think the more people see of him, the more that they realise that. You could see at our rally in Birmingham, 5,000 odd people of all different backgrounds, young and old. Obviously, I was one of the speakers. This is a party which has got a very positive message of hope for this country. And, that kind of behaviour, look, we can laugh about it. I actually think it's entirely counterproductive for the people who advocate for it.
Goodness me. Well, 14% of the vote. I'm going to ask my panel now, do we think that the Reform Party vote share is going to be higher or lower in 4 or 5 years' time at the next election? Callum, we're going to start with you.
Let's look back to 2015. 14% is roughly what UKIP got in 2015. That actually portion of the vote hasn't actually shifted that much. We're talking about Reform Surge. The Reform Surge it's just happened to be managed slightly better under the first past the post system. We're not talking about something that actually really exists.
OK, Matthew?
Massively.
If we want a second term for a Labour government, which I do, then it needs to be lower, and therefore Labour needs to listen to the concerns of Reform voters and make sure that it in no way dismisses those concerns.
And Niall?
Well, if the Conservatives continue down the path that they have been taking with Wets in command, really, of the party, then Reform's vote is going to significantly rise. Now, if the Conservatives move to the right and you have a leader such as Suella Braverman or Priti Patel, for example, I do think that that poses a challenge to Reform in terms of the number of votes that they can get. I expect that some Reform voters will move back to the Conservatives. But if you see more of the kind of Sunak-Cameron type of leadership, that's a huge problem for the Conservatives, and Reform will build and build.
It's interesting, Zia, just to round this conversation off, do you think the Conservative leadership contest, the shape of the Conservative Party, as it will be decided over the coming weeks and months, will have a material impact on whether or not these two parties can work together, create some sort of pact? Of course, there was the famous alliance in the 1980s between the SDP and the Liberals. Could that be something that the Reform Party would look at as a possibility?
Well, Nigel's been clear about this. That's not a club that he would want to join. We have all the momentum right now. Look, if we look at, even if you take Labour, who obviously are celebrating today, lower vote share, lower absolute number of votes than they got under Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, the Conservatives have been annihilated. The Lib Dems haven't really made material progress. We are not only the ones with momentum, we have momentum going up pretty much in a straight line over a short period of time. If you look at what's happened in France, and Nigel Farage is not Marine Le Pen by any means. However, you look at just what's happened in terms of shifting of votes. Marine Le Pen has gone from 18 to 36% of the vote share inside 2 years. Again, an unprecedented move in terms of French politics. We live in a new era now. You know, I hear a lot of people talking on political TV shows talking about how it's going to take decades. Again, as a startup person, as someone who's built a technology company, we live in a different era. And the total failure to understand the momentum that Reform have and the potential that we have, I think, is really interesting. So to answer your question directly, we're focused on continuing to build the Reform Party. And look, I don't even think the Conservatives, you're talking about a leadership process. They don't even know what the leadership process is. You know, they're talking about removing the right of Conservative members to even vote on their leaders, lest that they vote for the people that the MPs don't want. So I think, frankly, the Conservative Party is going to continue to be in a very difficult position for the foreseeable, and we're going to continue our momentum.
Goodness me. Well, Zia Youssef, thank you so much for talking through those big issues. And I do have to say, it does chime, this idea that voters are much more, well, the word that psephologists keep using and have used over the last 24 hours is promiscuous. A much more promiscuous electorate than at any time before. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate word to be using, but you know what? Political scientists have got to get their kicks somewhere.